All right, so this is part 2 of Special Boiler License Study Material from the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry. And the first part was statutes, and going to the next part, we're going to start rules. So, rules 5225.0050 definitions. Subpart 1, Scope. For the purposes of this chapter in Minnesota Statutes, Section 326B.952 to 326B.998, the following terms have the meanings given them. Subpart 2, Appurtenance. Appurtenance means equipment that is integral to the operation of the boiler as specified in Sections 1, 4, 6, and 7 of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code as incorporated by reference in Part 5225.0090. Subpart 3, Authorized Inspector. Authorized inspector means a commissioned inspector with a Minnesota Certificate of Competency who also possesses either an A or B endorsement and is regularly employed by an authorized inspection agency or the jurisdiction. Subpart 4, Boiler. Boiler means a vessel in which steam or other vapor, hot water, or other hot liquid is generated for use external to itself. Subpart 5, Boiler Plant. Boiler plant means all boilers on a common header and their related appurtenances. Subpart 6, Chief Boiler Inspector. Chief Boiler Inspector means the chief of the Division of Boiler Inspection as defined in Minnesota Statutes, Section 183.375, Subdivision 2, appointed by the Commissioner. Subpart 7, Chief Engineer. Chief Engineer means the properly licensed engineer required to be in charge of and responsible for the safe operation of a boiler plant. Subpart 8, Commissioned Inspector. Commissioned Inspector means one who has passed the exam of the National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors and possesses a valid National Board commission and is employed by an authorized inspection agency or the jurisdiction. Subpart 9, Commissioner. Commissioner means the commissioner of the department. Subpart 10, Department. Department means the Department of Labor and Industry. Subpart 11, Direct Supervision. Direct supervision by the properly licensed operating engineer of a boiler plant means oversight of an apprentice's activities on a boiler, including the attendance at the boiler plant at all times. Subpart 12, Division. Division means the Division of Boiler Inspection. Subpart 13, High Pressure Boiler. High Pressure Boiler means power boiler as defined in Section 1 of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code. Subpart 14, Operating Engineer. Operating engineer means a properly licensed individual who operates and maintains boilers and their appurtenances. Subpart 15, Operating Experience. Operating experience means activities in boiler operations and maintenance that include training, observation, and personal participation. Subpart 16, Operation. Operation means the act of manipulating and monitoring, except as provided in Minnesota Statutes, Section 326B.972, Paragraph B. Boilers or appurtenances to assure safe operation for the intended purpose in accordance with this chapter. Subpart 17, Repair Firm. Repair firm means a company or organization that holds a current R repair certificate of authorization issued by the National Board of Boiler and Pressure Vessel Inspectors and performs welded repairs or alterations on boilers or pressure vessels. Subpart 18, Shift Engineer. Shift engineer means the operating engineer responsible to the chief operating engineer in charge of and responsible for the safe operation of a boiler plant in the absence of the chief engineer. 5225.0400 Basic License Requirement and Duty. No person shall have charge of as the engineer or operate any boiler or boiler plant who does not possess a license of the class required to operate the boiler or boiler plant. It is the duty of the owner of a boiler or boiler plant and the chief engineer and all boiler inspectors, including those employed by insurance companies, to promptly report to the chief boiler inspector any boiler or boiler plant in which the engineer has no license or a license of a lower class than that required by law for the horsepower of the boiler or boiler plant. 5225.0550 Experience requirements and documentation for licensure as an operating engineer. Subpart 1. Compliance requirements. All applicants must comply with this chapter in Minnesota statutes as sections 326B.952 to 326B.998. The experience requirements are detailed in this part, and documentation requirements are detailed in Subpart 9. Applicants with previous experience in a jurisdiction requiring licensure must show proof of compliance with the licensure requirements of that jurisdiction in order to receive credit for the experience. All applicants for licensure as an operating engineer or hobby operating engineer shall provide documentation of operating experience for the level of class grade applied for in accordance with subparts 2 to 8. To be acceptable for this purpose, operating experience must have occurred within the 10 years prior to the license application. The chief boiler inspector may allow earlier operating experience if that experience is pertinent to current operations. Subpart 2. Special Class Experience Requirements. A special class license requires only a signed application form. No previous experience is necessary. Subpart 3. Second Class Experience Requirements. A second class license requires 1 year of operating experience documented as described in Subpart 9 on a boiler of proper size under Minnesota statutes section 326B.978, subdivisions 12 to 14. Subpart 10. Year defined. For purposes of this chapter, a year is at least 2,000 hours. However, in the case of low-pressure heating boilers, a year is defined as a 12-month period, which includes the heating season operating and the remainder of the year maintaining the low-pressure boiler. 5225.0600 Prohibition against false statements in application. Any material false statement in an application or affidavit, such as that the license would not have been granted if the accurate information had been provided, shall render the license void. The license shall not be determined to be void until the license holder has been provided with the opportunity for a meet and confer conference and/or an administrative hearing pursuant to Part 5225.0880. Subpart 5, and the requirements of the Administrative Procedure Act, and the charge of a materially false statement is upheld. 5225.0900 Display of license. Licenses granted must be displayed in a conspicuous place in the engine or boiler room. Boiler plants operated by a contract operating engineer must have a copy of the operating engineer's license of each person who may be operating the boiler posted in each boiler room. 5225.1000 Boiler Horsepower Rating. In rating the horsepower of a boiler plant, inspectors shall use the horsepower of each boiler and compute the total horsepower of all boilers connected to the header, whether all the boilers are in use or not. Where the heating surface cannot be discerned, The boiler horsepower shall be determined by calculating BTU boiler rated input divided by 67,000. In other words, one boiler horsepower is equivalent to 67,000 boiler BTU input. For purposes of operating engineer license requirements, boiler horsepower for conventional boilers and steam coil type generators is determined as provided in Minnesota statutes, section 326B.978, subdivision 17. For electrically operated boilers for this purpose, 10 kilowatts equal 1 boiler horsepower. 5225.1110 Boiler Operation Standards, All Plants. Subpart 1, Safe Boiler Operation. All boilers, unless specifically exempted by Minnesota Statutes Section 326B.988, must be operated, maintained, and attended by an operating engineer in a prudent and attentive manner to avoid endangering human life and property. At a minimum, all operating boilers must be checked by an operating engineer in compliance with this chapter. Specific minimum attendance requirements for hobby boilers are given in Part 5225.1140, and specific minimum attendance requirements for high-pressure plants are given in Part 5225.1180. In determining whether a boiler is operated, maintained, and attended in a prudent and attentive manner, the division and the chief engineer or operating engineer shall consider the recommendations of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, Section 6, for low pressure and Section 7 for high pressure, along with the following additional factors. A through G. A. The size or capacity of the boiler plant. B. The condition of boilers and appurtenances. C. The frequency of boiler checks and past maintenance history. D. The extent of public occupancy of the building containing the boiler plant. E. The operating service conditions, including weather. F. Compliance with other statutes and rules of this division. And G. Any other factor which would adversely affect the safety of the boiler. A logbook must be maintained in the boiler room by the chief engineer or an operating engineer designated by the chief engineer. The log shall document when the boiler checks were made, who made the boiler checks, and what specific checks of equipment were made. This log shall be made available to the boiler inspector during inspections and at other times upon request of the boiler inspector. Subpart 2, Unsafe Boiler Plant. If the chief engineer or operating engineer has found the boiler to be in an unsafe condition, the engineer shall notify the owner or employer and the chief boiler inspector as soon as possible. If the unsafe boiler is not immediately taken out of service, the chief engineer or operating engineer shall ensure that the boiler is continuously monitored by an operating engineer 24 hours per day, until the division has either sealed the object, verified the unsafe condition has been corrected, or determined that the continuous monitoring is no longer required. 5225.1180 Attendance at High Pressure Plant. Subpart 1, Attendance, Plant of 0 to 50 horsepower. At a minimum, a high-pressure boiler plant of 0 to 50 horsepower, when in operation, must be visually observed at least once every 24 hours by an operating engineer. The operating engineer must document the findings and conditions in the boiler room logbook maintained pursuant to Part 5225.1110. Subpart 2, Attendance, Plant of 51 to 500 horsepower. A high-pressure boiler plant of 51 to 500 horsepower may be left in operation unattended by an operating engineer for no more than 2 consecutive hours, except as permitted by Item B or Subpart 5. The operating engineer must visually observe the operating condition of the boiler and appurtenances at least every 2 hours and document the findings and conditions in the boiler room logbook maintained pursuant to Part 5225.1110. B. A high-pressure boiler plant of 51 to 500 horsepower is exempt from the high-pressure attendance requirements of Item A if the plant is operated at low pressure. All boilers must either be shut down or shifted to low pressure. If a boiler is shifted to low pressure, it must have the following controls, safety devices, and conditions. Following 7. 1. The boiler must be equipped with high pressure controls and low pressure controls. These controls must be arranged so that they cannot be operated at the same time. The header connecting the low pressure controls to the boiler must have an isolation valve and a drain valve. 2. The boiler must be equipped with fail-safe type safety controls for regulating pressure, water level, and fuel supply. Controls and safety devices must meet the minimum requirements for automatically fired boilers in Code Sections 1, 4, and Controls and Safety Devices for Automatically Fired Boilers, CSD-1, of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code. 3. The boiler must be equipped with a low-pressure header designed to prevent the system pressure from exceeding 15 psi. The low-pressure header must have ASME code stamped safety valves set at 15 psi or less. The low-pressure header safety valves must be constructed to ASME code section 1 or 4 requirements. 4. The low-pressure header must be equipped with an isolation valve that isolates the header from the boiler or piping. The valve must be interlocked with the controls to prevent the valve from being opened when the system pressure is greater than 15 psi. The valve must be interlocked with the high-pressure controls to prevent the high-pressure controls from operating when the valve is open. 5. The building in which the boiler is located must not be occupied by the public or employees except for custodial, maintenance, or security personnel. 6. An operating engineer must manually switch over the valves and controls between high and low pressure, enter the date and time of the switch in the boiler room logbook, and sign the logbook entry. And 7. When the boiler is operating on low pressure, an operating engineer must visually observe the boiler operating conditions at least once every 24 hours and record the conditions in the boiler room logbook, pursuant to Part 5225.1110. Subpart 3. Attendance. Plant over 500 horsepower. A high-pressure boiler plant of more than 500 horsepower, when in operation, requires constant attendance, except as otherwise provided in Item B or Subpart 5. B. The operating engineer in a high-pressure boiler plant of over 500 horsepower may leave the boiler room for up to 30 minutes if all boilers are equipped with dual pressure controls and dual low-water fuel cutouts, one of which must be the manual reset type. The operating engineer must stay within 500 feet of the boiler room at all times during the shift. Subpart 4. Repealed 42 SR 251. Subpart 5. Attendance unoccupied plant. This subpart applies to plants with individual boilers that are 51 to 500 horsepower located in an unoccupied plant. A high-pressure boiler 51 to 500 horsepower may participate in the remote monitoring program if it complies with the requirements in items A to N as follows. A. Boiler owners must submit an application in a manner prescribed by the Commissioner to the Department for review and approval to participate in the remote monitoring program for unoccupied plants. B. The building must be completely unoccupied, and the boiler owner must demonstrate with substantiated data that the unattended boiler is located within a safe unoccupied radius. C. An operating engineer must perform the remote monitoring. The boiler owner must develop a written policy for safe response time for each individual boiler. The operating engineer must be able to respond to any of the safety concerns listed in item L within the safe response time specified in the policy. D. The operating engineer must visually observe the operating condition of the boiler and the appurtenances in person and document the findings and conditions in the boiler room logbook, maintained pursuant to Part 5225.1110 at least once every 24 hours. E. When remotely monitoring high-pressure boilers 51 to 500 horsepower, the operating engineer must continuously monitor the following boiler conditions. 1. Water level for steam boilers. 2. Boiler pressure. 3. Temperature for high temperature hot liquid. 4. Stack temperature. 5. Feed water flow. 6. Makeup water flow for high temperature hot liquid. 7. Steam flow. 8. Fuel flow at burner. 9. Gas or oil pressure. 10. Concentration of carbon monoxide in boiler room. And 11. A video camera providing a continuous live feed of the burner, sight glass, and pressure gauge. The live video feed must be continuously available to the operating engineer for remote viewing. F. The boiler must have 2 feed pumps that supply water to the boiler. G. A boiler firing with gas must have a flammable gas detection system in the boiler room with a visible and audible alarm. The alarm must trigger before the gas reaches an explosive level. The alarms must be visible and audible inside the boiler room and on the remote monitoring device. Located immediately outside the boiler room door, there must be 1. Visible and audible alarms. 2. An independent remote water level indicator. And 3. Remote boiler shutdown switches. H. Boilers using gas or liquid fuels must have a written fuel-rich conditions shutdown procedure, which must be made available to the operators. I. Each boiler must have written standard and emergency operating procedures, which include testing of all safety devices at the manufacturer's recommended scheduled intervals. J. A diary must be maintained in the boiler room in a manner that prevents revisions, additions, or deletions. The diary must document, at a minimum, inspections. The diary must document, at a minimum, equipment startup and shutdown times, equipment repairs, equipment inspections, equipment maintenance, equipment testing performed, and the name of the operating engineer documenting these actions, inspections, and tests performed. The diary must be provided to a National Board Commissioned inspector upon request. K. The remote monitoring device and system must have a communication failure alarm. The operating engineer must return to the boiler room immediately upon notification of a communication failure. L. As recommended by the boiler manufacturer, the operating engineer must establish a primary set point that triggers an alarm and a secondary set point that automatically shuts down the boiler. The primary set point must trigger an alarm if the boiler conditions fall outside of the boiler's normal operating conditions, but are within an operating range in which the boiler is safe to operate temporarily. The secondary set point must trigger the boiler to automatically shut down when the boiler conditions are outside of safe operating conditions. The following items must have primary and secondary set points. 1. High and low water level for steam boilers. 2. High and low boiler pressure. 3. Temperature for high temperature hot water heating. 4. Concentration of carbon monoxide in boiler room. 5. Fuel flow. 6. Steam flow. 7. Gas oil pressure. And 8. Flammable gas detection. A flame sensor must trigger an alarm when a flame is not detected and automatically shut down the boiler. M. A national board commissioned inspector must conduct both initial, internal, and external inspection of the boilers to determine compliance with this subpart to qualify for remote monitoring. The internal inspection must be conducted while the boiler is not in operation. The internal inspection must be conducted while the boiler is in operation. I messed up. The internal inspection must be conducted while the boiler is not in operation. The external inspection must be conducted while the boiler is in operation. Annually thereafter, the National Board Commission Inspector must conduct internal and external inspections to ensure continued compliance with this subpart. The inspector must document the name of the water treatment company and the name of the certified water treatment specialist. The water treatment specialist must be certified to treat, test, and monitor the boiler water. Inspection reports must be submitted to the chief boiler inspector. N. The water treatment specialist must establish a water treatment program that contains boiler water quality parameters. The specialist must monitor the program at least every 60 days by testing the boiler water and reviewing the operating engineer's test results. The operating engineer must test and document the results of the boiler water at least every 24 hours. The test results must be provided to the specialist, the National Board Commissioned Inspector, or Chief Boiler Inspector upon request. The boiler owner and operating engineer are responsible for ensuring that the boiler meets all of the requirements of the remote monitoring program identified in Subpart 5. If the boiler owner or operating engineer determines that the boiler fails to meet the requirements of the remote monitoring program at any time, the owner or engineer must immediately comply with the constant attendance requirements in Subpart 3 until all deficiencies are corrected and restored to compliance with the remote monitoring program. All deficiencies and subsequent corrections must be documented by the operating engineer in the diary. If the Chief Boiler Inspector or National Board Commissioned Inspector determines that the boiler fails to comply with the requirements of this subpart, the boiler is disapproved for the remote monitoring program and must begin immediate compliance with the constant attendance requirements identified in Subpart 3. Reinstatement in the remote monitoring program is granted to the boiler owner by correcting the deficiency and obtaining verification of the correction from the National Board Commissioned Inspector. Evidence of the correction and verification must be submitted to the Chief Boiler Inspector prior to reinstatement. Phew, that was all for remote monitoring. All right, we're on to the new section here. Boiler safety. 5225.4100. Safety valves. Every high pressure or low pressure boiler must have at least one safety valve. A high pressure boiler of more than 500 square feet of water heating surface must have 2 or more safety valves. All safety valves must meet the requirements of Section 1, 4, or 8 of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code, and be so stamped, and be set no higher than the maximum allowable working pressure on the inspector's certificate for that boiler. Every safety valve must be connected to the boiler independent of any other connections and attached as close as possible to the boiler without any unnecessary pipe or fitting, and must stand in an upright position. No valve of any description may be placed between the required safety valve or valves and the boiler, nor on the discharge pipe between the safety valve and the point of discharge. All safety valves must discharge at a point of safety not less than 7 feet from running boards, platforms, or adjacent areas. No reduction in pipe size is allowed in discharge piping from a safety valve. The discharge pipe must be of sufficient size to allow complete discharge without back pressure. 5225.4200 Water gauge. When the boiler operating pressure exceeds 100 pounds per square inch, the water gauge glass must be fitted with either a gate type or plug type valved drain to a safe discharge point. If the lowest water gauge shutoff valve is more than 7 feet above the floor or platform from which it is operated, the operating mechanism must indicate by its position whether the valve is opened or closed. Installation must meet the requirements of Section 1 of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code for high-pressure boilers or Section 4 for low-pressure boilers. 5225.440 Steam gauge. For steam boilers, the steam gauges must meet the requirements of Section 1 for high-pressure boilers and Section 4 for low-pressure boilers of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code to correctly record pressure. Each steam gauge must be connected to a siphon of at least 1/4 inch pipe size and be fitted with a valve provided with a T or lever handle arranged to be parallel to the pipe in which it is located when the valve is open. If the pipe is longer than 10 feet, a shutoff valve or valve arranged so that it can be locked or sealed open may be used near the boiler. The dial of the steam gauge must be graduated to approximately double the pressure at which the safety valve is set, but in no case to less than 1.5 times this pressure. 5225.4700 Common main connection. When 2 or more boilers are connected to a common steam main, the steam connection from each boiler having a manhole opening must be fitted with 2 stop valves having an ample free flow drain between them. The stop valves installed on high-pressure steam boilers must consist of either one automatic non-return valve set next to the boiler and a second valve on the outside screw and yoke type or 2 valves of the outside screw and yoke type. The free blow drain must ensure complete removal of all condensate and steam from between the 2 stop valves. 5225.4800 Blow-off piping, valves and fittings. Each boiler must have a bottom blow-off pipe fitted with a valve or cock in direct connection with the lowest water space practicable. All fittings between the boiler and valves must be of steel for pressure over 100 pounds per square inch. 5225.5000 Feed piping and check valve. The feed pipe must be provided with a check valve near the boiler and a valve or cock between the check valve and boiler. When 2 or more boilers are fed from a common source, there must be a globe or regulating valve on the branch to each boiler between the check valve and the source of supply. Wherever globe valves are used on feed piping, the inlet must be under the disc. A combination stop and check valve in which there is only one seat and disc and a valve stem is provided to close the valve when the stem is screwed down must be considered only as a stop valve, and a check valve must be installed as provided in the first paragraph of this part. 5225.5100 Feed water supply. A high-pressure boiler having more than 500 square feet of water heating surface, 50 boiler horsepower, must have at least 2 means of feeding. Each source of feeding must be capable of supplying water to the boiler at a pressure of 3% higher than the highest setting of any safety valve on the boiler. For boilers that are fired with solid fuel not in suspension, and for boilers whose setting or heat source can continue to supply sufficient heat to cause damage to the boiler if the feed supply is interrupted, one such means of feeding must not be susceptible to the same interruption as the other, and each source must provide sufficient water to prevent damage to the boiler. When electrically driven feed pumps are used and there is no other reliable independent source of electrical supply, there must be maintained ready for service steam-driven feed pumps or injectors, inspirators of sufficient capacity to safeguard the boilers in case of failure of electric power. It appears that concludes the second part of Special Boiler License Study Material from the Minnesota Department of Labor and Industry.